Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and this is the Epistemology Consultant podcast. I'm here with my producer, James Allen. Hi, James.
Hey, how you doing?
And James does great work helping field the questions that come in from the audience. And he was sent a question and an article about both topics, guns and pro-life, or really having those come together as being pro-life about guns.
Yep.
And so I want to look at the article and then reflect on this as a philosopher. So I like to say this at the beginning because it helps set expectations of what kind of answer are we talking about here. So this is a epistemology consultant, a philosophical podcast, and I'm a philosopher. And so I'm not a theologian or a politician or a psychologist or an activist. Those are all fine fields, but I'm just not doing those things. I'm doing philosophy. So this article might have a lot of overlap with those fields, but I'm going to raise some questions about the philosophical content, which is something I don't actually see done very often. James, do you see that?
No, I don't. I think that's why this is unique. And I think
this will be helpful
because it connects with those other areas. Because the idea is it's the most basic part of the university, right?
Yeah, I think so. So this is philosophical, and we're going to look at the philosophical assumptions behind the article, and that's logically prior to practical solutions.
Yep.
But I think we spend most of our time on the practical, like, okay, we don't like gun violence. Agreed. What do we do about it? And one side will say fewer guns, and another side will say more guns. And they both think that will solve, what they have in common is they think that will solve gun violence. But so we're not going to solve it with that means. We're going to ask, well, what are the more basic questions that lead to having this practical problem? And I think this author, tries to get at some of those. So let me switch over here to the article for those watching. This is in the magazine or on the webpage Christianity Today, which is a well-known Christian publication. And the title is White Churches, It's Time to Go Pro-Life on Guns by Charlie Dates. And the subtitle, The Christian Majority in America Needs to Shake Off Its Malaise and Work with Black Pastors to End Shooting Violence. All right, so he lives and ministers in Chicago. So he brings up Chicago right away as a place where there is significant gun violence. But he says, and I guess the governor of Texas had brought that up, but he says that this is a well-established dog whistle and the refuge of Republican politicians and many of their Christian supporters. And specifically, what is that? The deaths of Black kids due to gun violence in Chicago. For them, my city, he says, is proof positive that gun laws don't work. Now, the word dog whistle there means that you bring up a phrase that is known to certain people in your audience, but maybe not the whole audience. And so it's kind of like an insider term that alerts them to your intentions. And a lot of times it's meant to be a racial thing. It alerts them to your view of race or your view of class status. So, all right, he's going to argue now against this view of Chicago. So governor of Texas, and now he's shifting to the Southern Baptist Convention, which is politically influential, and I think it's the largest of the Protestant denominations in the United States. And he says, I am not the first Black pastor to appeal to the white Christian majority to shake off their malaise and address pressing issues of justice. All right, so that's another word, justice, that will have insider importance of what exactly is justice. And in fact, that's switching back to my notes would be a good first question. What is justice? That's really what a philosopher would wonder. And if you're familiar with philosophy, you know that that's the topic of the first the first president of the Academy. Plato's largest work, The Republic, is
All
about
justice. Yeah.
this question: what is justice? Now, a lot of times we'll just go barreling ahead and we think, oh, I know what justice is. Now let's debate it. But the problems that come up in the debate, the differences I think you'll see between this author and someone that he's arguing against are they have different understandings of what justice is. And so part of what we want to do in philosophy is get clarity on a term. So we're not operating out of vague definitions or out of internal intuitions that are not yet expressed. We want to ask and have a clear concept here. What exactly is justice? So let's put that there. We'll come back to it. Now, he says about 30 years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention began an aggressive recruitment of young Black clergy. And they started, and he lists what they did, offering money and jobs and missional networks and having featuring speakers of color. Linked to this invitation to preach the gospel together came an entreaty. Black pastors in the churches were to adopt the political agenda of the so-called moral majority. So they want them to become Southern Baptist ministers, but that means accepting the majority view of morality and politics. And he says, if you are true to the God of the Bible, they said, the Southern Baptists, you had to affirm that abortion, adoption, pornography, and the war on drugs were the key moral issues framing the American social landscape. They deemed these issues Christian, while labeling a host of other concerns plaguing my community as political and divisive. So let me switch back to the notes.
Oh, that was awesome, because that kind of gets at the idea of things being more or less basic, right?
Yeah.
And the disagreement on that. Like,
good. Yeah. So what are the key moral issues that need to be addressed?
Yeah. Which ones? The ones in your community, the one in mine? How about ones that are universal to everybody first?
Yeah.
And then we can work together on different communities, right?
Yeah, you're giving a spoiler where we're going to go.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. But yeah, communities disagree about this. And you may not be aware of that. If you're mostly within one community and don't have a lot of contact with people outside your community, you might just think that your community's concerns are human, universal concerns. And he's saying, look, that's not the case. What they face in their community is different. So gun reform, for example, has always been placed in the category of politics, but it's now considered the leading cause of death for children in this country. In an era when hopes for interracial cooperation waxed high, Black pastors and churches migrated into dual affiliation. They did not leave their Black denominational homes of the National Baptist Convention or the Progressive National Baptist Convention. They merged both worlds as a signal of racial reconciliation. Enduring their cross and despising their shame, they sat down at the table of brotherhood. So they were willing to come and hear the other communities' concerns. But it's been 30 years. And as far as I can see, he says, we're probably more divided socially and ethically, if not politically, than we were back then. So that's just
not working.
Yeah. He says, we are more divided now than 30 years ago. So whatever we tried isn't working. The Black church has heard your requests to, I guess this is to the Southern Baptists or other white majority churches, for unity and fellowship and solidarity on public moral arguments. And we've watched you parade the case for the unborn as the single greatest civic concern of our time. And some of us have even lent the credibility of our ministries to urge our politicians towards a more virtuous ethic. So in good faith, we've joined our cause with yours. But now we ask the same of you. Is not our senators who reject universal background checks on the purchase of firearms? It's yours. So a practical difference. A practical solution difference. Universal background checks. You've asked us to fight for pro-life legislation, and now we ask you to do the same. Be pro-life by urging your congressional leaders to protect the lives of school kids who die in the force of weapons too easily placed in the wrong hands. And we've waited for you to use your influence to lobby Congress for better school funding, healthcare, food security. I want to list those. Also, better school funding, healthcare, and what was it? Food.
Oh, and
Food security. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he says, we've waited for you to declare that our lives matter. In short, I think you should leave Chicago's name out of your mouth until you understand the forces that shape this city. We are not your rhetorical whipping boy trotted out for another session of mockery that serves your political ends. We're not your minstrel show played on repeat on your news channels as a way to reinforce tropes about the inherent dangerousness of Black people. We see what you're doing and name it for what it is, racism. We know that you do not actually care about the Black lives lost in gun violence here. If you did, you wouldn't use dead Black boys and girls as a political tool. Now, this paragraph stands out to me as different from what he's described that the majority school asked, or the majority Christians asked of him. I don't know anything about that history. I haven't studied much about the Southern Baptists. So they may have done this, but this seems different, where he went from saying, we've agreed to your political concerns, now you should agree to ours. But now he's specifically charging them with something, racism.
Yeah. Right.
And that's a charge that would have to be proven.
Yep.
It isn't true just because someone says it is,
or you feel it, or you are interpreting it that way. Yeah,
it might be true. Now, I'm not. What I'm saying is, if it's true, you'd have to prove that's true. But it's not the same as a negotiating point where you say to someone, "Hey, I want to work together, but by the way, you're this."
Yeah.
Usually that kind of breaks down negotiations for working together until you can show that that's true. Now, that gets back to my point earlier about intuition. Someone could just simply say, I think this is true. But what we're doing in philosophy is we want to get a specific definition. What is racism? And that's really a question and a debate that our culture has been having for some time now. What is racism?
It seems like it's broken down to the point to where you're not even allowed to define it, because if you are a person of color and a person who is not of color is acting, doing, or saying certain things, the definition has gotten so broad that what it meant 20, 30 years ago doesn't mean that today.
Yeah.
And so it gets to be confusing, right? To where it's almost like making that charge in that paragraph should put us back to say, well, we don't want to be racist, so therefore we'll change gun laws. You know,
yeah. Well, so that's what he said though here. It seems to fit in with point 3 I typed down, which is that we're more divided now than we were 30 years ago. So there's more racism now than there was 30 years ago. But as a philosopher, that's what I would ask is, okay, well, what exactly is racism though? And how do we prove it's true of someone? Now let's keep going here on his he spends some more time defending Chicago and not having Chicago used as an example. Also makes a case here about how the drug laws have created a number of social problems. And that what's not mentioned about Chicago is the hard work of pastors and religious leaders on the ground in the city. So what I would wonder there is, what are the pastors and religious leaders doing? I actually know someone who does that kind of work in Chicago, and he's a Reform guy who likes R.C. Sproul. So he does really interesting work, but I think he stands out as a lot different than some of the other kinds of work being done by pastors and religious leaders. So I would want to, I'd raise questions. He doesn't give us any details here, but exactly what's going on with these are things after having put in a ton of time by pastors and religious leaders, have things gotten better, or is that one of the things that's gotten worse? And so a secular person could say, hey, that's just proof that pastors and religious leaders aren't helping.
They definitely don't seem to be.
Yeah.
From either perspective, right? He's even it's an interesting thing where he's almost saying that outside forces are the ones that are causing these internal struggles in a city where they've been laboring for so long to try to get things to be different, and where they have some of the most strictest gun laws in the country.
Yeah, that has been so far what he said is it's external things, drug laws, for example, that have created problems. But then his last paragraph, he gets back to Martin Luther King Jr., and he understands why Martin Luther King Jr. took pen to paper in the Birmingham jail, because when there are laws that should liberate you, but instead they imprison you, the one person a pastor expects to help him is another pastor. So that was a letter written to other pastors to bring into focus the civil rights problems that Martin Luther King Jr. was working on. He was in prison because he'd wanted to have a parade. Or it wasn't a parade, it was a demonstration, and he didn't get I guess there was need for a parade permit, and that was a way of keeping him from being able to speak. It was just kind of an arbitrary thing to give him a ticket over.
Right.
And they used this arbitrary law to put him in prison so he couldn't speak. And so that was a way of imprisoning him. Yeah, that's right. That was an unjust use of law. And so this last sentence caught my attention here. It's frustrating that some of those who stand in the way of human flourishing are those sermonizing the Imago Dei into a political talking point. And what stood out to me especially was human flourishing. And I can relate to his point here about making it political. Why and when do we rely on the political? So these are questions that came out from the article as I was reading it, different than political questions or conservative versus liberal questions. What is justice? And I think you'd have to answer number 1 before you can answer number 5 about what is racism. Because the idea is that you're unjustly treating another person due to their race. So then you say, okay, well, what is justice then? And it seems that justice is treating all humans as humans. Justice gets the idea of equality. Humans are humans. So you don't treat some humans better than other humans. That's unjust. Does that seem pretty clear definition?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Plato works with something like that in his Republic, but he doesn't actually believe all humans are equal.
He does not, no.
So Plato makes some significant mistakes that have reverberated down since his time. So I'm assuming humans are humans. There are differences among us, but those differences don't override our shared humanity. And then what especially stands out about humans is the need for meaning or understanding. Now, and I think this article is an illustration of that, right? He's presenting his case. He's arguing with his opponents and trying to help them understand what he says he understands. And that's fundamental. That's what humans do. Fundamental doesn't mean it's the only thing humans do, but it's the fundamental thing. All the other things humans do, sports, law, business, family, education, politics, all come back to having this shared thing in common that we want to understand things. So he's calling for common understanding, which I think is right. we've made, maybe summarize it this way. We've made sacrifices to work with you and accepted your concerns. Now it is your turn to do the same for us. Now and this model has broken down back up to this idea that we're more divided now than we were before. So maybe I would suggest as a philosopher that this model of working together isn't the right one. We didn't come to see working together can come in degrees based on the extent to which we have a common understanding.
Yep.
So if what happened was you said, okay, look, James, I'll work with you. I know your big concern is collecting Pokemon cards. So once a week, I'm going to go with you to a Pokemon convention and buy Pokemon cards. And then in my mind, what I'm thinking is, I hope James comes around eventually to doing the same for me about baseball cards. And you never do. That's really frustrating. I really don't like doing this Pokemon card stuff. Now, I'm using a really simple example. That's all it's meant to be taken as.
I like baseball cards, though.
I know, but these issues are weighty issues. And so I don't want anyone to think I'm saying they're similar to Pokemon. That's not the analogy. The analogy is just,
that's not how
I have a concern, you have a concern, and we don't have any common ground. Yeah.
Well, what it shows is that the concern for the unborn and the concern for the other issues that he said he partnered with 30 years ago really weren't that important to him. He did it in hopes to get them to pay attention to these concerns. And what's interesting is it possible that both concerns are important?
Yeah.
You know,
I would think he would probably say that they're both important, but they maybe have different emphases for different communities.
Yeah. Which is
based
weird.
on the problems in those communities.
That's where I kind of thought it was weird, because it's, it gets at where if we can't know what justice is or what moral issues are, then we're not going to ever be able to solve anything, for sure. Yeah. But then it's interesting to think that, gun violence isn't just violence in Black neighborhoods. In fact, it's also violence in white neighborhoods, because what you have is a majority of white kids shooting up schools. And so both, Black and white communities dealing with that, right? So it's,
well, and you'll have other communities that don't have any guns, like London, that have a lot of knife violence.
Yep.
So you're going to find
same thing in Canada, right? There was the outlawing handguns, and then I think a couple knife attacks. I'm not trying to over exaggerate it, but they were pointed out to, I think, show the irony that, okay, sure, some guns cause more damage than others, but the issue isn't the gun. You know, there's a practical and then also an underlying issue, for sure.
But I think his article is great. That last sentence, particularly for this reason, it summarizes the thing we need to have common ground on. What is human flourishing? We want to act justly
towards that goal.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that all humans can pursue human flourishing. Well, flourishing is autocorrect into
human flushing.
Yeah. Flourishing. But what is it? Now,
you think a bunch of pastors might be able to agree on that, right?
Well, I think they would agree.
Okay. What is
largely the conservative Christian groups define this as heaven, otherworldliness. And in contrast to that, what is sometimes called progressivism or liberalism defines it as this worldly alleviation of suffering.
Yep.
So we don't have a common ground. Those two groups, they don't have a common ground, even about what human flourishing is. So the way he phrased it about abortion and virtue was a good example, because the idea is that you need to be virtuous to go to heaven.
Yeah.
But he said, look, you can pursue all this virtue all you want, and it doesn't actually necessarily alleviate suffering of people in this life. Now, I'm going to agree. He didn't talk about otherworldliness, so I don't know his view on that. But I'm going to suggest, yeah, this is just wrong. Heaven as an otherworldly place where you get stuff is not the correct view of human flourishing. Human flourishing has to begin in understanding the meaning and purpose of life. So if we look at the breakdown of families, which the conservatives like to bring up, or we look at drug violence and how drug laws have contributed to the breakdown of families, either one, let's say you had no more broken down families and no more drug laws, you would still have people who don't know what the meaning of life is. In a previous podcast, I brought up the book Brave New World, which has a city where everything is perfect in terms of outward suffering, but the people there still need the government to put a drug in their drinking water that makes them happy all the time, or else they'll start to feel existential emptiness. So I'm going to suggest that as a philosopher, the common ground that would allow people with different concerns, because I don't think it's wrong to have different concerns based on the community. That's why local government is really important, because different communities have different concerns.
But not different basic concerns, like, like justice, life.
Yeah.
What is racism? They all should share those, that understanding. But they'll have different problems that come up based on where they're at, location, geography, money, food production, whatever.
Yep. So I'm going to suggest, though, that before we can even address those, we have to come back to this more basic issue. So 2 things: common ground in meaning, and problems are logically ordered, which is part of common ground. Less basic and more basic. Logically, not, that doesn't mean in level of importance, like what's really important to me is basic. No, it might be really important to you, but it's not actually the most basic problem you're facing. So that's what I would add to this is, as a philosopher, is we've got communities who can barely talk to each other. And he says that these are it's worse now than it was 30 years ago. So that's in the 1990s. It's worse in the 2020s than it was in the 90s. So things haven't been working. So we shouldn't try more of the same that didn't work. We should back up and say, well, wait a minute, let's use this as a chance to stop and think. Maybe we don't have the common ground we thought we had, and we need to reassess that. Now, that doesn't actually solve the pro-guns and pro-life issue. And that's what I think James was here hoping for. He just wanted me to give a policy on guns and pro-life.
I'm trying to get you to run for office. And I was hoping if I did a podcast with you, that over time I could convince you to write policies for politics. And you just want to do Pokemon.
I knew you had a secret motive. Well, here's the thing. He uses guns and pro-life in a way that you might hear from people, which is, well, if you care about not aborting babies, you should care about school children. And school children are getting killed by guns, so you should want to get rid of guns. Now, there's a couple places, that's one of them, where I think he's going to turn off his intended audience, either by calling them a racist or by saying they don't care about school children getting killed by guns, because I think that what the conservative would say is, of course I'm pro-life on guns. That's why you need armed teachers to protect children.
Yep.
So that's not going to be a fruitful way of dialoguing. In other words, what you want to do is you can want to say, look, we both agree we want to protect children. I think it means fewer guns. You think it means more guns. Let's figure this out together. Instead of saying to the person, I care about children, you don't care about children. Well, that's not probably going to result in a discussion.
It also seems like he's saying, like, sure, we're pro-life. Not really, because then if you're pro-life, you can't be, you can't believe in guns. You can't believe in capital punishment.
Yeah.
So it seems like these are an overextension of the agreed definition socially to try to prove a point. Like, we really can't convince you. So we're trying to show you why you're hypocritical.
Yeah.
And it seems to miss, what people are actually meaning by it.
Yeah.
And so it's not that I'm trying to push the other group to be like, hey, that it's just like, let's be intellectually honest here. If you believe that human life starts at conception, then okay, that's an agreed upon point.
Yeah.
If you think that people are evil and we need guns to protect ourselves because of that, then that's an agreed upon point, right?
Mhm.
And so, you know what I mean? So if somebody violates the law and kills somebody else, that it might be a just punishment for them to die. Like these are all
Yeah.
different things. It's just,
Yeah.
and so it feels like, it's just not a
Well,
very good convincing argument because it's,
no, yeah. Putting
yeah,
putting your opponents down. And really that's why I think the philosophical method would have served better, which is this. What do you mean? So you're pro-life, what do you mean? Or you're pro-guns, what do you mean? And then what are you assuming? And then I'll tell you my same thing. It's not just asking them questions. Here's what I mean, and here's what I'm assuming. And that would have gone a lot further, because I think this point he's making, which is good, we're more divided now than 30 years ago. So something's
that's
not
true.
working.
Yeah,
So
that's
we
true.
need to back up and say, we're not hearing each other.
Yep.
Let's figure out why not. And actually, that what seems a little bit depressing, things are worse now than they were 30 years ago, can get used for greater growth.
Yep.
As a great opportunity to grow.
I think that's good. And I think you writing out what is justice, especially when most of us want to talk about what racism is, right? Because we're around people that would say, well, James, you're white, therefore you're racist. It's just you have a racist bias built into you that you can't help, or an institution is racist. And so it's, again, you get into these conversations where you're wanting to define words in a way to help. But I think going back to justice helps. And then you can walk along, because
and human flourishing.
Yeah. If you can't even know what justice is, then you can't have a conversation about racism. And if you can't have an idea, right, about, I think what you got in another podcast, you do this a lot with studying natural law and the moral law. If I can't know what's good for me, and that you're human and I'm a human, and it's the same thing at a basic level, right? Then this conversation is pointless. It's going to come down to a power struggle, which is a lot of what it does a lot. Yeah.
So what you're highlighting is our need to define terms. And when we don't do that, we won't be able to come to agreement. And I on point 6, I added point 6 is what is human flourishing? And I added it, same thing, but different wording. What's a good life? What does a good human life look like? And I think it wouldn't be very hard to show that a good human life primarily has to do with one who has a meaningful life.
Isn't it interesting that, like, that definition, human flourishing, what is a good life, is based on understanding terms, which assumes we can actually know, which assumes that you and I can say, well, this is what I mean by justice. Okay, well, yeah, you're right. We do have those things in common. And it's a level that this isn't like a mathematical axiom to where you have to have, a PhD in physics to understand.
Yeah. Well, it's right. It's maybe summarized this way. Come, let us reason together.
Yeah.
So we can think together and debate these questions. And I think that's what I thought this article did a good job of, is bringing out some of the things that we need to discuss and pointing out that, it could be hard sometimes to say this. So I'm glad that he did. Things are getting worse, not better right now. So we need a plan for that.
I think that's good. And I think talking about that agreed upon practical thing that the Southern Baptist Church did in reaching out and trying to recruit, I think there are probably some truth to that. I haven't studied it either, but that's a very practical thing a lot of Christian institutions do, which is, hey, let's do some outreach, but let's do some outreach where we get people to assume the same principles we are.
Yeah.
And I am pro-life, and I do believe in guns, and I do believe in capital punishment. So to me, those things aren't contradictory.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, if you're not defining what pro-life even means, you'll find massive disagreements even within that movement, right? On things like birth control, things on exceptions, things on how about this one? Even what to do when someone has an abortion. Like, should there be punishment? Is there an actual consequence by law, right?
Yeah.
That's a big one too. So again, you have to get back to defining terms. And for me, what I'm learning is,
to solve any of those problems, you'd have to say, what do we mean?
Yeah. So what I've learned about myself is, and I'm kind of going through a period of like relearning some things and rethinking through a lot of things that I believe, is that if I can't show you why I believe what I do, I probably shouldn't be talking to you because I'm just making declarations that are furthering the problem.
Yeah. You might not be actually answering any issues.
Yeah. What I ended up doing is playing on your bias and going, yep, that's the same thing. But yeah, so it's annoying for me when people are like, if you're pro-life, you should be anti-guns, because the solution is simple to fix the school shooting problem, which is this: be as pro-life on and be anti-gun. And it's like, yeah, I mean, school shootings are a recent phenomenon that have started, and then you have gun violence, and so it's like you could look at the communities in Chicago and say, well, it's not like that in Atlanta, or it's not like that in Austin, or it's not like that in Houston, or it's not like that in Dallas. What's the difference? And the difference isn't just guns, because they have the most restrictive gun laws around. And so it's something else here. So it seems like,
well, I wonder if he would say it's the application. The example he brought up, I think, was marijuana drug laws. So somehow those might have been enforced differently in the cities you mentioned. I don't know.
Sure.
I'm just suggesting what he might respond to explain those differences.
Right.
And the uneven application of drug laws.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem too. And a lot of conservative people might say, "Oh, give me a break." But yeah, I think that's a problem too. But what's interesting is the fact that he says there's different communities that have different, different values, kind of thing. It just shows that different communities are dealing with problems differently, but you still see the same human problem that's there.
That comes back to our
yeah.
our philosophical method down here, right? What do you mean? What are you assuming? Can we have common ground in finding meaning about what is it to flourish? Yep. Maybe we have assumptions about human flourishing, but we've never really spelled that out. And one thing that can happen with human flourishing is that if we think our neighbor is flourishing and I'm not flourishing, I begin to covet my neighbor and his flourishing. But I think if we truly define human flourishing, then there's never any room for envy or covet, because nothing can keep us from what is actually good. Now, we've done some podcasts, and I also have some YouTube videos about that question: what is good and what is the meaning of life?
Maybe we can link to those in the description to kind of connect.
Because we're not going to address that now. But this is analysis of a article in a very well-known Christian publication about guns and pro-life and about how to work together. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for your help, James.
Yeah. Thank you, Owen. And maybe you should run for political office. I mean, has there ever been a philosopher who did politics who wasn't killed? Wait a minute. Never mind.
You're trying to give me a
bad example.
Yeah. Well, what about having a podcast that helps politicians learn how to question their assumptions?
If I send this to them, they're all going to get mad at me because I used to do some stuff in politics. Maybe I'll do that.
Oh, yeah. Well, in other words, what I'm saying is there's the guy who does politics, but then there's the guy who helps politicians question their assumptions and learn how to have common ground.
I get it. Yep. No, I think that's good. I have hope that if we approach it that way, common ground could happen because people are rational. And I think we do want to get at a solution,
Yeah. Yeah. Good. So thanks again, everyone. And we'll see you next time.